do recording.
Go for it, Gladys.
Okay, thank you. So nice to see you. I'm just enjoying looking at everybody. Thank you for coming. Hello, dear friends. Welcome to the Women Learning Group of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of Montreal. Today is Wednesday, May 22nd, 2024, 14 ER 5784. We have the second sessions of 8 Wednesdays, series number 30, and hosted by Sandra Kuku with thanks and all the success. It is the 30th series. My name is Gladys Mualem, coordinator of Women Learning Group Montreal. We are happy you joined us following the great success of last week's session, which was recorded with thanks by Xenia. We look forward to seeing you for the coming 6 Wednesdays with the same Zoom details. Sandra Kuku, bevakasha, bechavod.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Again, thank you, Gladys, for giving us such a beautiful thing to take and continue even further. Today, we're going to see another side of Tevye. Last week, it was good news, but the bad news is from here on, it's not going to be so happy. But throughout it, Tevye always holds his faith, and in a way, he's like a first responder for us. So the discussion passage here is, and whose fault is it? It's my own, for having been taken in by a lot of hot air. And we'll see why he's saying that. Take it from me, the only way to make money is to work your bottom off, which is where you, Tevye, deserve to get a swift kick. But what good does it do to cry about it? It's just like it says in the Bible, you can scream till you burst. Who says that anyone is listening? Senya, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for introducing us.
Oh, dear Lord. You made many, many poor people. I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor. But it's no great honor either. So what would have been so terrible if I had a small fortune? If I were a rich man, all day long I biddy-biddy-bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a biddy-biddy rich, idle-diddle-diddle man, I'd build a big tall house with rooms by the dozen right in the middle of the town. A fine tin roof with the real wooden floors below. There would be one long staircase just going up and one even longer coming down, and one more leading nowhere just for show. I'd fill my yard with the chicks and turkeys and geese and ducks for the town to see and hear, squawking just as noisily as they can. And each loud will land like a trumpet on the ear, as if to say, here lives a wealthy man. If I were a rich man, yabba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dum, all day long I biddy-biddy-bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. Yabba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dum. If I were a biddy-biddy rich, idle-diddle-diddle-diddle man, I see my wife, my gold, looking like a rich man's wife with a proper double chin, supervising meals to her heart's delight. I see her putting on airs and strutting like a peacock. Oh, what a happy mood she's in, screaming at the servants day and night. The most important man in town will come to phone on me. They will ask me to advise them like a Solomon the wise. If you please, Rebbe Tevye, pardon me, Rebbe Tevye, posing problems that would cross a rabbi's eyes. And it won't make one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. If I were rich, I'd have the time that I like to sit in the synagogue and pray, and maybe have a seat by the eastern wall. And I discuss the holy books with a learned man 7 hours every day. And that would be the sweetest thing of all. If I were a rich man, yabba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dum, all day long I biddy-biddy-bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. Yabba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dibba-dum. Lord, who made the lion and the lamb, you decreed I should be what I am. Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man?
I can see that you don't know very much about our legal system here. If you'll just let me explain it to you, you will understand in a jiffy how a man can live here and not live here at one and the same time.
Professor Wisse, what are we going to see in the second lecture now?
Well, the second lecture is about the second story in the Tevye series. I think when he wrote the first story, he had no idea that he was ever going to write another. But it seems that he liked this character so much that after a year or so more, he decided to do something quite extraordinary. He brought his character, Tevye, together with a character whom he had created 3 years earlier called Menachem Mendel. And he brought them together for this one and only time in this second story in the Tevye series. And so here's Menachem Mendel. He is this, what you would, crazy entrepreneur, schemer, dreamer, and he's discovered the stock market.
Right.
So he is your first capitalist, but not the man who is actually with the capital and not the person who really is the broker of this capital or the real high-level investor. He is just your guy who is getting in on this deal, and he thinks, well, if there's money to be made in this magical new way, who better than me? So what you have is Menachem Mendel meeting Tevye. Tevye, who has just gotten a toehold on a real economic, secure way of making a living. How do these two way of making a living? How do these two fit? So what we have here, though, is a contrast. What a contrast between the first story, Tevye strikes it rich, and this second, Tevye blows a small fortune. Same dairyman, same location, serving the same customers, and only a couple of years older, is telling us the opposite story. Not about winning, but about losing. Not of what can go right in life, but what can go wrong. So we're entitled, I think we're almost obliged to ask, so what's going on? Was Tevye changed because he accumulated 100 rubles? Is this juxtaposition intended to make us wary and suspicious rather than hopeful? So what's the connection between episodes 1 and 2, if any? Or do they just stand side by side as a problem? So sometime after Tevye's first appearance, Sholem Aleichem turned to him again and did something striking. He brought Tevye together with another of his characters, Menachem Mendel, for their one and only fictional encounter. So Sholem Aleichem had created Menachem Mendel in 1892, which is 2.5 or 3 years before he introduced Tevye. So that Menachem Mendel was already a staple of Yiddish humor. People would say about a certain kind of person, he is a Menachem Mendel. He's a comic type in perpetual motion, always scheming and dreaming. Depending on your temperament and political outlook, you could emphasize either his compulsive optimism and his refusal to give in to failure, or his gullibility, his imprudence, his recklessness, and lack of consideration for others. Since Sholem Aleichem's readers would have been familiar with this Menachem Mendel type and with these stories, I think we should know a little bit about how he appears in the works that bear his name. Menachem Mendel is the hero of an epistolary fiction, that is, a story that is told through a series of letters, and these letters are between him and Shana Shendel, his wife, the mother of his children. He turns up in our story as a cousin of Tevye's wife, Golda, a third cousin, actually, a distant relative, but a blood relative of his wife, Golda. And this is a relation close enough to win him some trust and allegiance. But in the letters, he is an absentee husband who has gone out into the world to seek his fortune. And the letter exchange between him and Shana Shendel follows the same repetitive pattern. He has left his shtetl. Menachem Mendel, you see, is the product of a shtetl. He has left his town of Kasrilivke, which translates as the town of cheerful paupers, the town of the cheerfully poor. So he's left, this is also a town which Sholem Aleichem invented, a fictional version of towns. And he's gone off to the big city, ostensibly to collect his wife's dowry from the relative who was holding it, but he gets hooked on the stock exchange. And instead of returning home, he writes home about his exciting business ventures. And this is how he sounds in one of those letters that he writes to Shana Shendel. Yesterday, for example, I played the market for 50 rubles, and by noon today, I'd lost them all. But I haven't told you what playing the market is. You can buy futures for 50 rubles or double that, or hedge until closing time. That's the time between Mincha and Mariv in Kaschilivke. Well, I bought short, the market was up, and there went my 50 smackaroos. That's how you play it. But don't worry, my dear. 50 smackaroos are nothing in Odessa. With God's help, my lucky number will come up, and so on. This is the same kind of investment that he proposes to Tevye. And any trained broker or investor would have recognized a novice. But Menachem Mendel is not the kind of man to learn from experience. A person of this kind, the Menachem Mendel kind, and he became a prototype of the kind, is called a Luftmensch, literally an air person, a person who lives on air, someone with his head in the clouds, economically a man without any identifiable steady work or profession. And here's the thing, according to one historian, an estimated 40% of Russian Jewish men fell into this category, right? Talk about the unemployed. So Menachem Mendel writes Shana Shendel about his magnificent schemes, and she, in her part of the exchange of letters, replies, "Cut your losses and come home." She says, "I wasn't raised in a home where we bought and sold air, and God keep me from doing it now. From air you catch cold," Mother says. "Who ever heard of a grown man playing in a market? You'll make more sense if you wrote me in Turkish," right? So Menachem Mendel is not Bernie Madoff, right? He's not that variety of swindler who is running some pyramid scheme. He's merely enchanted by the novelty and the excitement and the promise of seeing money grow. But the wife needs him home, and she has no faith in his promises, and so the exchanges between them become more cutting and more comical as he keeps repeating the same cycle of plunging into something new, losing, and then starting over again. And this predictability is played completely for comic effect. So there's something interesting. The French Jewish philosopher Henri Bergson, who incidentally was born the same year as Sholem Aleichem, wrote about laughter, and he perceived that laughter can be caused by something mechanical encrusted on the living. This is a very interesting conception. He made a lot of that. What does he mean by that? It's, for example, a person keeps tripping over the same object. So you often see this in films, in plays, where a person is walking along and then trips over something. The audience laughs. Then if he does it again, it's hilarious, right? Why is it hilarious? Well, Bergson analyzes this to say it's because you expect human behavior to be something living, adaptable, whereas the person acts mechanically. See, he acts as if he's just robotically going through this. So the idea of something mechanical encrusted on the living, I'm giving it very bare bones interpretation, but something of this kind he sees as being an occasion for laughter. And in this case, we see that it's because Menachem Mendel keeps going through the same doomed behavior over and over again. So in this letter exchange, both sides are equally stuck. He in flight, and she is the harridan housewife trying to rein in her husband. We are laughing in the Menachem Mendel stories at the characters. They show no self-awareness, no adaptability, no evolution. Now, this is the stuff in our parlance, and I don't know whether you're too young for this, but this is the stuff of the Peanuts cartoons, where Lucy is always pulling away the football so that Charlie will take a fall. And the Jew is stuck in the same way in this unending cycle of hope and failure. When Menachem Mendel turns up in the Tevye story, the dynamics are very different. Tevye is Menachem Mendel's antithesis, the supremely responsible husband and father who consults his wife before he makes any significant move. Tevye is the more solid character, literally pulling his own weight sometimes. When his horse can't pull his wagon. He sometimes has to pull the wagon. So he literally is pulling his own weight in dairy products. And he was always responsive. Menachem Mendel acts, Tevye is acted upon. Menachem Mendel is impulsive, refuses to look before he leaps. Tevye thinks hard before taking a risk. And having once lost it in this episode, he never tries anything like it again. So Menachem Mendel stimulates Tevye. He infects Tevye with his enthusiasm in this second story. So what happens, as you know, is this. Tevye is in Yehupitz, making his deliveries, and he runs into his wife's distant relative, Menachem Mendel, who looks down and out, as though he could use a square meal. Menachem Mendel accepts the invitation, and both Tevye and his wife enjoy being able to extend hospitality. And this is so lovely. You see how far he's come. Now he is the one who is able to extend hospitality to others. But Menachem Mendel never relaxes. He has to be doing business, and he infects Tevye with the, as Hillel Halkin puts it, the itch to be rich. He talks Tevye into investing with him the 100 rubles that he has so painstakingly managed to save. They will be partners, splitting the profits, Tevye putting up the capital and Menachem Mendel doing the investing. No need to wonder about the outcome for anybody who knows Menachem Mendel. Menachem Mendel's ventures always crash. But how does this affect Tevye? So Tevye can't resist the temptation, and this will be the first of the challenges that we see him facing. What was this challenge? I think you could call it the new opportunities of capitalism. The first two episodes, and this one in particular, highlight the changing socioeconomic conditions and their effects on the Jews, who played an oversized role in the economic life of their host societies, and they were therefore disproportionately affected by economic developments. In the first story, Tevye was the beneficiary of the cooperation among Jews, but now we see that these close relatives, that is to say, these interrelated types, these fellow Jews, we see them cooperating in a much riskier venture. Sholem Aleichem exposes the characters to something that both promises and threatens their livelihood and security. In order to understand this, we are expected to know something about the conditions of Jews at the time. So, just very lightly, so first, Tsarist rulers then restricted Jews to a region known as the Pale of Settlement, an area of about 386,000 square miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. This was intended to curb the spread of the Jews and to prevent competition in the big cities, because they were not allowed into the large cities. You can look much of this up in sources like the Virtual Jewish Library or the YIVO Encyclopedia for Jewish Research. Both of these excellent resources are available online. So according to the census of 1897, almost 5 million Jews lived within those boundaries. They formed 94% of the total Jewish population of Russia and 11.6% of the general population of that area. Excluded from the Pale, as I say, were the cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. Now you see what this means. This means that neither Tevye nor Menachem Mendel has any right to reside in Yehupitz, which is the fictional Kiev. Menachem Mendel has been living in Yehupitz illegally for almost a year and a half. He has to be there because that's the only place where he can take advantage of the new stock exchange, but he is not allowed to be there to compete with the others. So he is forced into illegality to exercise what should be a citizen's equal rights. When Tevye asks him about it, he says, "Shh, not so loud. I do live here, but that's strictly between the two of us. Tevye fails to understand. If you're hiding from the law, are you sure that the main street of Yehupitz is the place for it? Ask me no questions, Reb Tevye, he says. That's how it is. I can see that you don't know very much about our legal system here. If you'll just let me explain it to you, you will understand in a jiffy how a man can live here and not live here at one and the same time. So live here and not live here at one and the same time pretty precisely describes the situation of the Jew who is trying to survive in a world that intends to expel him. So you see how legally precarious, economically precarious, in every way precarious this situation of Menachem Mendel is. That's first. Now, secondly, worse than the restrictions governing Jewish residence and opportunity were the selective exceptions that Alexander II granted to some Jews and not others. For example, to merchants who were able to pay a high registration fee in the guild, to dentists, midwives, and certain needed professionals. So Sholem Aleichem and the wealthy Jews in the first story who are vacationing in Boiberik, they are legally able to live in Kiev, but Tevye, who sells them these dairy products, was not. He could only sell his goods there during the day. And as a matter of fact, Sholem Aleichem, our author, had experienced these things personally because, as I mentioned, he had gone bankrupt. Until he went bankrupt, he was a merchant of a certain class, so he could legally reside in Kiev. But when he went bankrupt and had to flee, he could no longer reside in Kiev. And until he got enough money back so that he could reacquire his participation in the guild, his wife, Olga, studied dentistry so that she could get the legal permission to live in Kiev. So you see, when Sholem Aleichem, who is basically on a higher level, is writing about Tevye, he is writing about something that he knows for all that at first hand through his own experience and not only, imaginatively. So Sholem Aleichem was very acutely aware that when everyone is in the same boat, they may benefit by pulling together, but a political economic wedge that splits the community is likely to undermine collective behavior and morale. So the lucky break in the first story is the Jews show unity in order to overcome what divides them. But in the second story, unity doesn't overcome the problem. In fact, the presumption of unity may encourage a false sense of trust. Now, neither Tevye nor Menachem Mendel is allowed to benefit from the capitalism that lets shareholders take part in an expanding economy. But Menachem Mendel does not intend to be shut out. When he discovers that ordinary people are allowed to invest in industries and projects that they could neither build nor possess, he intends to take advantage of this hugely democratizing moment. People who were not born into aristocracy can now be catapulted into the upper strata of society. Menachem Mendel loves capitalism's freedom as the ultimate engine of democracy. It upends inherited status and even professional standing in favor of those who successfully make and manage money. But this is a very hazardous business. There are no guarantees. One can lose as simply as one can win, more easily if you don't understand the rules or the odds. Tevye, who is still our speaker here and our main character here, Tevye's motives, as you see in getting into this, are mixed. He meets Menachem Mendel as a bedraggled loser. He takes pity on the man. This time, Tevye, as I say, is the benefactor of another Jew. But rather than Tevye's stability, putting Menachem Mendel on a stronger footing, the speculator's instability pulls the stronger man down. Tevye is tempted, he succumbs, loses his investment, and never again recovers those precious 100 rubles. The impulse to help this struggling relative is no permanent benefit to either of them. So if one Jew helps the other, and if that in the first story works to Tevye's advantage, and if the help that he now extends works against him, it seems that Jewish solidarity is not in itself enough to guarantee that it will be an advantage. It all depends on the uses to which this is put. So the final thing to include as background to this second Tevye story was that it appeared in 1899 in Der Yid, the Jew. That's what it was called, Der Yid, a Yiddish publication established by the Zionist movement soon after the Zionist movement was founded. The weekly was founded in order to disseminate and strengthen the Zionist idea. That is where this story appeared, right? So Sholem Aleichem was by then one of the best known and most beloved Jewish writers, but it isn't immediately clear how either he or the editors or readers thought that this story was connected with a movement of national self-liberation. Maybe the editors included it because Sholem Aleichem was a big name, but they wouldn't have included it if it had violated the Zionist message. So we can, in some ways, wonder how this episode contributes to our understanding of the modern Jewish people as a modern Jewish people. Now, the Marxists, and believe me, at this time, 1897, the revolutionary movements were in full force in Russia, and Jews played a pretty big role in some of them. So the Marxists were very clear in their understanding of Menachem Mendel, both in his own stories and in this one. They adored him. They adored him because to them, he was the caricature of capitalism run amok. And this is how the critic Max Erich in the Soviet Union in 1935 describes the character he considered Sholem Aleichem's greatest creation. The central idea of Menachem Mendel, he writes, is the rejection of the possibility that the petty bourgeoisie will succeed through capitalism. Satire on the bourgeois illusions of the lower middle class, scathing, demolishing critique of the Luftmensch and his so-called livelihoods. So you see, Erich called the Menachem Mendel letters a great progressive work for the way it mocked the Jew who fell into the capitalist trap. And this is how Menachem Mendel remained in the Soviet Jewish imagination throughout, as long as there was a Soviet Union. And just to show you how big Menachem Mendel became in this, let's just see a clip of a 1925 Soviet movie, a silent film still, called Jewish Luck, Yiddische Glicken. It was made with Yiddish subtitles. It stars the person who was the greatest actor of the Soviet Union, Solomon Shloime Michoels. And this is Michoels playing the role of Menachem Mendel. This is a scene on the famous Odessa steppes, and it is a scene of Menachem Mendel when he is playing the role of the matchmaker. And here he is running to meet someone who he thinks is going to be a very, very saleable prospective bride. You see to what extent this is a caricature. Michoels, the way he walks, this caricature of the Jew of a certain kind. Menachem Mendel almost, floating up the steps the way he walks. But all of it really heightened in a certain direction. And all of it to mock, right, this figure who believes that he's going to be, in this case, a matchmaker. And finally, at the end, as he does in the Menachem Mendel stories, he matches two brides. So that's, of course, how a Menachem Mendel adventure is bound to end. So this is how he is presented here in the Soviet Yiddish imagination, the great Sholem Aleichem figure that they loved, because they see in him, you see, the taking down of the capitalist possibility. And conversely, Max Erich, whom I quoted, has very little use for Tevye as the petit bourgeois Jew who wants to maintain his traditional way of life. Erich accused Sholem Aleichem of throwing a veil of idealization over Tevye instead of exposing his false traditionalism. You see, that's how this was understood, and I would say throughout the Yiddish world, throughout the Jewish world. But since Menachem Mendel appears in the story of Tevye and not the other way around, this could not have been Sholem Aleicham's intention. Tevye is indeed infected by dreams of wealth to the point that he's willing to invest with Menachem Mendel. We see him letting himself go in fantasies and daydream. But when the scheme fails, he slowly unravels and takes full share of responsibility for the loss. He absolves Menachem Mendel of blame, finally. Tevye is not reducible to mockery. He's able to criticize himself. After all, it's ridiculous to suppose, he says to Menachem Mendel, it's ridiculous to suppose that you did it on purpose because you were a partner, just like me. Whose fault is it? It's my own, for having been taken in by a lot of hot air. Take it from me. The only way to make money is to work your bottom off. It's just like it says in the Bible, V'tzaka hanara. You can scream until you burst. Who says that anyone is listening? Wisdom and second thoughts are two things that always come too late. Tevye just wasn't meant to be upper crust. That's not how God wanted it. Hashem nasan, v'Hashem lakach. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. In which case, says Rashi, cheer up, my friend, and let's go have a shot of brandy. This is as close as we ever get to a moral of the story. If you're trying to figure out how to deal with the vicissitudes of life, you'd better not reach too far beyond what you can control, because even there you're guaranteed no security. And as far as capitalism is concerned, granted that it is liberating and irresistible, but the Jew also has to stay rooted in a steadier sense of reality. I'm interpreting this, but this is how I would see, more or less, if you wanted to draw a moral conclusion. Now, Tevye's very language in this conveys something very different from Menachem Mendel, who speaks in the terminology of options and poptions. Tevye experiences life, including this investment, through what one scholar calls the art of quotation. His narration draws so resourcefully from the well of Jewish sources as to make it an ongoing commentary on the Jewish way of life. Like in the passage just quoted, when Tevye pivots from bemoaning his loss to admitting his folly, he says, V'tzoaka hana'ara. And I advise you always to look it up in the glossary if you are using this excellent edition, right? And what is this from? From Deuteronomy chapter 22, that sets out the laws of rape. The full passage reads, if the man comes upon an engaged girl in the open country, and the man lies with her by force, only the man who lay with her shall die, but you shall do nothing to the girl. The girl did not incur the death penalty, for the case is like that of a man attacking another and murdering him. He came upon her in the open, though the girl cried for help, V'tzoaka hanara. There was no one to save her. And then when Tevye adds, you can scream till you burst, who says that anyone is listening? He is declaring his innocence, issuing his cry, and acknowledging that no one is going to come to his assistance. And when he then sums up his loss in the phrase from the book of Job that is traditionally recited at funerals, God has given and God has taken, he's saying that it feels like a death. Paradoxically and humorously, these phrases and these sayings give him the means to fully express how violated he feels. What Tevye has absorbed from his tradition gives him an added register of language that Menachem Mendel lacks. And here you see it really in full force. He really wants to tell you how much pain he is. And you see from the two quotations that he draws right all together is really, everything he's telling you. It's like a death, right? It's like a violation, and it's like a death. And he's innocent, but who cares? Who's going to listen? But Tevye will never give in to despair, in which case, says Rashi, cheer up and let's have a shot of brandy. After a funeral, one has to take something to quicken the spirits. Tevye is an interpreter of sources. I call him a comical Rashi. The art of quotation is his brandy, his pick-me-up. This referential richness, this improvisation, is why Tevye was interpreted very differently by mainstream Jewish critics than he was by the communists. They saw in him the Jew trying to keep his balance between an excess of hope and hopelessness. That is to say, the more traditional Jewish readers, and I would say the mainstream of Jewish criticism, Yiddish literary criticism, saw in Tevye someone who was trying to keep his psychological and moral balance. Sholem Aleichem said that he wrote to bring comfort to his people. And who better than Tevye to demonstrate the technique? So I think this in part tells us what this story was doing in a Zionist weekly. There was an argument at the heart of the Zionist movement between those who thought in material terms that the goal of recovering sovereignty in the land of Israel could be achieved by adding a dunam to a dunam and a cow to a cow. Facts on the ground. And between those who believed that it was first necessary to bring about a cultural transformation that would prepare the Jewish people for the recovery of their national sovereignty. Those who favored the slower approach were also split into different camps. Hebraists, like Eliezer ben Yehuda and Achad Ha'am, knew that Hebrew would have to replace all other languages, especially Yiddish, since it was the only Jewish language that united the Jewish people through space and through time. And there were others like Sholem Aleichem, who was the furthest thing from an ideologue. And he knew that Yiddish was the common language of over 10 million Jews, and the only language in which a man like Tevye could speak his mind, or a reader anywhere in the range of a Tevye could read a work. So some of the new culture would doubtless consist of rousing hymns, poems of national affirmation, but it was no less important to provide a cultural vocabulary that reflected some of the challenges facing the Jews, their weaknesses as well as their strengths. Sholem Aleichem and Tevye are the vocabulary for modern Jewish discussion. They provide these. If you can talk about your situation through the discussion of Menachem Mendel and Tevye and their interrelation. So readers recognized in Tevye and Menachem Mendel two Jewish psychological, national, and spiritual types, both struggling to survive against political odds. Tevye says over and over again that a Jew cannot live without faith. This is as true for him in the modern world as it was in ancient times. Menachem Mendel is the instinct of faith, either a caricature of the messianic impulse or its embodiment. He represents the principle that drives Jews never to weigh the odds or to consider the cost of survival. He is the bridegroom who is afloat in the paintings of Marc Chagall. Tevye's belief is greatly tempered by experience, and his is the harder struggle. He has to keep going, knowing the adversity he faces, taking every blow in stride. So on the eve of the Second World War, in 1939, the writer Yechiel Yeshaya Trunk, whose dates are 1997 to 1961, younger than Sholem Aleichem by a generation, he wrote a book called Tevye and Menachem Mendel in Jewish Destiny. Tevye and Menachem Mendel in Jiddischen Weltgeurel, interpreting these two characters as the embodiment of the way the Jewish people in its entirety confronts its destiny in modern times, a destiny that's not only troubled, but tragic because of the overpowering enmity that Jews confront. And how does he see them? He sees Tevye as a figure of ironic resignation who never gives up the covenantal contract with the Almighty, but is well aware of the disparity between God's promise and Jewish experience. The back and forth in Tevye's prayer between affirmation and protest conveys this precarious balance. Menachem Mendel, for his part, is the inborn hopefulness that never concedes to rational disproof. So at first, this is so interesting, at first Trunk tells us that of course he valued Tevye much higher for his sanity and moral balance. He finds Tevye intellectually more mature, the better model, but when Trunk had to flee from the Nazis, he found that Tevye's balance could not stand up against the insanity of Europe. He needed Menachem Mendel's transcendent hopes that could never be quelled. Menachem Mendel seemed psychologically impervious to failure, and Trunk took this as his model of resistance in extreme case. So Trunk, this very sophisticated writer, who had lived his life as a sophisticated European, had to call on Menachem Mendel's impracticality during the Shoah. Now you may be sitting here and thinking, wait a minute, is this the story that we just read about a dairyman who gets the itch to be rich and lets himself be talked into some cockamamie scheme by a deadbeat speculator who, instead of asking for a handout, tries to sell him on an investment that he doesn't know the first thing about? You mean to tell me that this plot that's worthy of some half-hour sitcom triggered an argument over its interpretation between Jewish communists and nationalists about which of their worldviews it actually serves? Are you saying that am I saying this because I know what happened in the decades after this story appeared? For example, that Max Erich, who went to the Soviet Union, who saw only the caricature of Menachem Mendel, died in Stalin's gulag, and that others were shot in his prisons, in Stalin's prisons, and because Sholem Aleichem's Tevyes were victims of the final solution. Is that why we're trying to attach some retroactive significance to the story, as though it foreshadowed those events? Wasn't this intended just as light entertainment? And wasn't that its achievement? Well, I would say entertainment, certainly, for sure. Sholem Aleichem always said that he had a talent for mimicry, and I would be doing this story a disservice if I in any way slighted the laughter that it provides, even though I haven't provided very much of it. But Sholem Aleichem's genius was to see the accumulation of Jewish wisdom in Jewish humor, and to channel that incongruity into his fiction. So Sholem Aleichem's Jewish hero, you see, is not a Clark Kent who sheds his nerdy self to become Superman. And he is not the Superman who deep down under his uniform knows that he is Clark Kent. He is not a bifurcated hero, but the ordinary Jew who extraordinarily manages to be both these things at once. He is like the biblical Isaiah and Job, refined through Rashi and Yiddish folklore. Speech is as yet the only source of his power, right? Having not yet acquired any other independent means of self-defense. So Sholem Aleichem gives us that power at its source, and writing in a Zionist publication, he still leaves it to others to supply any other forms of protection that Zionism may find necessary to acquire. Thus far, the second episode.
Professor Wisse, could you just review some of the conclusions we should have in mind as we leave Lecture 2 and prepare for the next one?
Well, I think it's sobering. The conclusion that we have really brings us down to earth with a bang. If we thought that the beginning of the Tevye stories was going to introduce us into this marvelous formula for Jewish survival, That is to say, the rich and the poor, the big city people and the country people, the more educated and the less educated are somehow or other going to be able to work together, and this relationship between them is going to be the foundations of a strong modern people that come away from the first lecture. All of this is exploded in the second lecture. Now, what's the takeaway from this? Well, one of the things that I tried to show is it depended very, very much on where you stood politically and philosophically as to how you interpreted this. Of course, the left, the communists, the whole rising socialist movement saw Menachem Mendel as a caricature of capitalism. This is, you see what happens? This is what capitalism does to you. But on the other hand, the amazing thing is that there were others who saw in him the messianic impulse. And we see that these two things could not be farther apart. How can the same story suggest to one person that this is a satire of capitalism run amok, and to someone else that this is the Jewish messianic impulse unleashed in the world? Well, there you have it.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. You're our flower. Thank you.
Sorry for the occasional things pop up and then take over my screen, and I'm like,
You're amazing.
sorry
You
about
do,
that.
you troubleshoot, and you're amazing. Thank you so
All good,
much.
no problem.
Shelley, what were your thoughts? I'm putting you on the spot.
Basically what Ruth Wisse said. Okay, I can't say it better than how she said it.
Yeah. It's amazing how she brings out exactly what we are living through today. On the one hand, the left is so insistent on a certain worldview. And then on the other hand, there are others who hold out with things such as hope and fear of God and dreaming of a better world. It's exactly the same today. Nothing seems to have changed. Can I, Gladys, finish with a joke?
Of course. We need it. Bravo.
It might not even apply to here, but anything with Judaism applies to everywhere. So I'll give it a shot. Thank you. So Rabbi Manis Friedman, a Chabad rabbi, he was visited by a friend, a neighbor. He's Christian, and he happens to pass by, wants to say hello. And he looks around in the kitchen and he says, "What happened?" And he sees aluminum paper covering so many surfaces. And he says, "Well, it's Passover." And his friend says, "What's that?" So he says, "You know, we were slaves in Egypt and God took us out. He took us to freedom, and so we celebrate." He says, "How long ago was that?" He says, "About 3,000 years ago." He says, his friend says, "That long ago? Get over it." So yeah, you know, and later, you know, in many of his Dvar Torahs, Rabbi Friedman, he says, we weren't looking for God. He came looking for us and took us out, you know, the outstretched arm and all that. He's the one who came, took us and brought us out. So, and we can never get over it. So now I know where he got that expression from. We can never get over that. And we should never get over that.
Because
So, yeah,
things get repeated. And
we need to remember. We need
Things
to
get
remember.
every few years, and we have to fight it again in the same way. So all the stories make us understand that we have power inside us. And when we are in a bad situation, it will not stay. It will change. And this is what gives us hope and give us the power inside us to fight all the problems that we face. And we hope that we always succeed. And we always celebrate ourselves as winners. And we'll be the same like now. We are in the same situation again. But we are positive, and we know good things will come.
And it was easy for many Jews during the Holocaust to lose faith in God. And I remember in Iran when my father was in prison, at one point, I honestly thought that the mullahs, they seem to be more powerful than God. They seem to have a stranglehold on everything. And I looked up and it's just like they were the umbrella and God was up there. And I wouldn't be able to have access to God. But somehow that God instinct prevailed. And I think I was visited by my grandfather and in a moment of silence. And I think he's the one who came through for me. That's why I believe that our departed are here and they see even better because they don't have to see through an organ like an eye. They see much more clearly. There's a lot that's been written about that. I was trying to get somewhere and I forgot what it was. Something that Rabbi Friedman said about about the Holocaust. So you can forget, that there is a God in the face of so much cruelty. But he talks about there were two brothers. They were liberated. Here the British come and they liberate the camp. And they come out and there's nowhere to go. Where should they go? They don't have a home anymore. They don't even know how to get out of this place. It looks like safer even just to go back and to their bunker, which they're familiar with. So they are greeted by this Polish woman. She came with a big basket with fresh bread from the oven, hot bread. And these two brothers, she gave them this bread. So these two brothers, they made a vow to each other that because God brought us this bread, every Shabbat we're going to read the Psalms, the whole thing, 1 to 150, which is what they did and they still do today. Because Rabbi Friedman asked them, would you come and join us once a month to read the Psalms? They said, only once a month? He said, well, he said, we read it every Shabbat. And he told them the story and he said, where does this kind of faith come from? How can such a faith exist? They were decimated in the concentration camps, and because they found that this was a gift of God at the moment when they were liberated, they have to thank God for the rest of their lives for that bread. I think
This
Tevye
reminds me of your date, Baba, that you distribute and everybody love it. It's nice to distribute. Nice. Gigi, you have anything to tell us? You must have a lot.
The only thing that comes to mind right now is that somebody would see, a critic would see in Menachem Mendel a Messiah-like character. I understand the sense of a miracle out of all the darkness and the terror that the people are living through, the turmoil in society, the nothing seems to improve. You cling so much, the Jew clings so much to hope. And as Professor Wisse said, there is this covenant that Jews who are religious or who have been brought up with religion, they consciously or unconsciously cling to, that you made a promise, God, and it's got to come through. So maybe that Mendel was this sort of ridiculous character, inconsiderate in the sense that he didn't care about the consequences of his actions on others. On the other hand, he stood perhaps in people's minds or subconsciously as the possible miracle. Out of nothing, out of craziness, out of darkness, there will be some great change and some wonderful thing happening to us, and we will no longer suffer the way we have been. So I find that interesting that this Menachem Mendel character was perceived as possibly a messianic symbol, and which never occurred to me. But once I was exposed to the idea that he was a messianic symbol for some, I understood why.
In fact, one of the discussion questions is, in what way or ways is Menachem Mendel's optimism particularly Jewish? Is Menachem Mendel's satire run amok the embodiment of the Jewish messianic impulse, or both? Yeah, it could be both. But this is why Sholem Aleichem was such a revered writer, because he unearthed all these possibilities.
Right.
That's the job of the artist,
right?
Is to bring out all the nuances. There's not only one way, there's many ways. And certainly in those days, it brought out it accentuated the sharp distinction between these different camps. One is the traditional, and the other one is this new wave of, Stalinism, Marxist ideology, everyone should be equal. Well, that comes from a very Jewish principle that there's no king, or the only king is up there, and all the rest of us are on one and the same level. On Shabbat, everybody rests.
Our history on which we believe that there's some divine element to it, So every aspect of our history is important. So when we look back at the Exodus, we can't just say, well, we didn't like being slaves, etc. No, it was much more than that. It was a belief in an egalitarian society, a just society
Exactly.
that we have to work towards. And in fact, I remember reading many years ago about archaeological finds, and which they believed would have been possessions of people leaving Egypt. And they said there was no ornamentation on them. So it was as if everybody owned the same type of thing. One was not given more food than another. One was not given better, pottery than another. So there was the belief when they first left in egalitarianism, and definitely not master over slave, or over
Right.
servant. You have to
Right.
treat. He came up with all these laws, Sinai, etc. That even a servant, if somebody runs away from you, like a slave, first of all, you can only have a slave for maximum 7 years. If there's a what do you call it, a jubilee year, in the second year, you have to free that person. If the slave runs away, contrary to the American tradition, where the slave, if he was caught, was punished. Here, if the slave ran away, the owner was punished because he hadn't been treating his slave as a human being properly with consideration. So there's that sense of equality, but it can't be equitable. It has to be equal. So equal before the law, equal opportunity wherever possible, that sort of thing. So
Exactly.
a striving towards something better, and Eden.
But you know what? Like Rabbi Sachs pointed out, when you, like Dennis Prager points out, when you take God out of the equation, you lose any possibility of wisdom. And when you throw that out, you've lost civilization. And so to that point, to your point, Rabbi Sachs says, but when, as the Marxists did, this thing of equality, it's all about the market. Look at where it leads to. Like, you can say that religion caused a lot of violence and death, like, of course, in the Spanish Inquisition and the jihadists and all. But he says communism created far more violence and annihilation than religion. And education is doing the same thing. Look at Germany. It was so educated. And he says, look at, Rabbi Friedman said, look at bin Laden. He had education. He was an engineer. The Hamas people, they all have, a lot of them are very brilliant. They are engineers. Look at what religion and education has done. So we're back to that messianic instinct.
But the other thing that you said, the other factor, and I think it's so underrated, we barely speak about it, we sort of mention it in passing, and that is wisdom. When you think, and you said that Rabbi Sachs made a parallel between having a sense or a belief and a faith in God and becoming wise, and you can't have wisdom without a sense of God. And when I think about Tevye, why does he trust himself and his own judgment and his perceptions and his conclusions? It's because he relates to God, he relates to his religious thinking, and he knows that there is a sanity there. He trusts it, and he comes up with with an understanding. And why is the revolution run by young people? Because they have no wisdom based on
Bravo.
experience. They have
Bravo.
nothing. So
They're
that's
so gullible.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
As
So
we will see later on in this series.
Yes. Vivi, you want to say something?
Me?
Vivi
Yeah.
looks like
Am
she
I
was
on?
very
Hi.
interested.
Tell us something. We like to hear.
Am I muted?
No, you're not. Vivi, you look like you're very engaged, like you were so listening and you were interested.
Yes.
in the
I had
story.
to listen very hard. It was like very immense, you know, and a lot of information she gave.
Yeah.
And her language is amazing, you know, so like you really have to listen hard to understand what she's trying to say. I loved it when he brought out the issue of when if he were a rich man, and his wife would be a rich wife and she'd look like a peacock and all dressed, and the fact that she would have a double chin, which I mean, you see now, like when you go to the Hasidic synagogues and everything, and the woman is dressed in her best hat and jewelry, and the collar is up to here, and the double chin, and she's like the boss of the house. She's got like 5, 6 little ones beside her. But it doesn't matter. She is the one, and you can tell from the way she carries herself how like the image is very, very forward and very strong. And you see that's still amazing, eh? It hasn't changed.
And he says, if I were rich, I would sit in the synagogue near
Yeah,
the
and
Eastern
pray.
Wall, and I would pray 7 hours a day, but
Yes,
I have to earn a living.
yeah.
Gigi,
yeah,
what
if I may pick up on what you were saying, Vivi. And first, two things. One is that definitely European women, I mean, the East European women,
Yes.
not the West European, that's a whole different, or even Middle Europeans, a different mentality. It's like saying, oh, you're Sephardi, Moroccan, and Iraqi are the same. No, you're very, very different. And similarly, Poles and Germans, especially Eastern Poles and Western Germans, they're worlds apart. Okay, so back to Eastern European women, they were tough. They were strong. They were
Very
called
tough.
alabustas, you know, the bosses, the whatever, because they had to, as we found out, many of them, their husbands either were very poor or they had disappeared. They were absentee fathers and husbands. There is that. Or they were scholars. They studied the whole time. So the women had to know how to survive and keep the family intact. But what I want you to also say, the second thing is the singing. So the film version, the play version, as I wrote in my first little comments, brief comments, is that they're so different. The themes are so different from the original. The last thing that Tevye would want or crave for is status. Status didn't mean anything to him. Showing off didn't mean anything to him. Having an easier life, yes, I can understand that. I think he would want that. But to show off, no. The status, no, I don't see it at all.
Absolutely. Yes, I see your point, and that's exactly what she's aiming at through 8 lectures. And you get to see it more so in the very last. I'm not going to ruin the surprise element, but you're so right. And that's exactly why she proposed to do this series, because, you know, of course, to make it a commercial success, you have to round it out with all kinds of humor like this. And it worked. It did. It reached so many audiences. It was translated into so many languages. You can see Tevye in Japanese. And I do remember, you know, Gigi, you just reminded me, a friend of mine at a place I used to work in like 15 years ago. She's a French Quebecoise. She used to be separatist, you know, all the way. And then later on, we sat around the table and one of our women bosses, they were both women, wonderful. She told her, listen, if we were gonna be separatists like this, it's almost like being the difference between Sunni and Shia. In one sentence, she brought her around to a different way of thinking. But so she told me, you know, Sandra, I watched this film. It's called Fiddler on the Roof. Have you seen it? She says, wow, I learned so much about you. Is that the way the Jews are?
Yes.
It's wonderful. It was
Human
so
nature.
amazing.
Yes.
And you know what, you know, all these different countries that do the play, they can relate to. It's not only for Jews, it's for all parents who, you know, try to pass down their values and then the children rebel. It's a
Exactly.
universal dilemma.
It's exactly true. Very true. And there was so much humor in it. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
as poor as they were and hardworking, and the days is like, who wants to wake up to feed the cows, to, you know, milk the cows, feed the hen? But there was so much humor in their life in
That's
order
right.
for them to live it through. And you can see how he changed when he was a young man to when he became older and lived through his life.
And
It's a change that we all go through.
and to your point, you know, she even points out some way along the line.
Sorry.
To her point, you know, says, oh, you know what? Even when they had to leave this place which they loved, you know, which they grew up in, and they buried their dead over there. And when they're leaving, as they're leaving, they said, what was it anyway, Anatevka, you know? Like, it's with this kind of forward thinking that we, the Jews, it is messianic, that we have survived until now. We wouldn't have been able to all these years. And that's why I love that joke about the Christian friend telling the rabbi, get over it. We can never get over it. And that's why we're still here. We never got over the fact that God was leading us to a promised land, but that promised land is also a metaphor for the world to come. And like you said, yeah, equal, all of us, but equal in the sense that we care for the widow and the orphan. And that phrase is never mentioned in the communist writings. It's not about that. And the communists and the leftists, they are the wealthiest of them all. And if you cannot agree with them, they won't even listen. Gigi.
Okay,
Yes, I am so glad that you said what you did, especially at the last few a few ideas, because really Judaism is irreconcilable with communism and with fascism, with any ideology in which the individual is not important, does not have significance. In fact, everyone claims that the Greeks and the Romans, especially the Greeks, started democracy. No, what they did is they gave rights to men. You had to be male and you had to own property. The Jews, on the other hand, gave rights, not in terms of land, etc., but legal rights, moral rights, etc., to every single human being. It doesn't matter his gender, his status, etc. Why? Because they said, Judaism says everyone has a soul. So the Greeks, if they had a baby that was small and weak, they would very, very frequently kill that baby. Okay, they would commit infanticide. In Judaism, every single individual has a reason to be here, and that's true democracy. That you are significant. You don't have that in fascism, you don't have that in communism, but you have it in Judaism.
And it just seems, doesn't it, Gigi, that they copied a few of our principles, but then they added it on and made it, their way. They fashioned it in their way, and it loses the original purpose. And the original purpose is simply that everything is infused with a spark of the Creator. And when you take that out, then things go run amok.
Yes, yes.
Gladys, sorry, we're doing all the talking. We want to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a beautiful series that you chose, Sandra. Thank you very much. And since everybody is learning a lot from it, and the best thing is to bring everybody together and learn and enjoy the lecture, the music, and everything together. And Xenia put it so nicely that
she's our flower. She really is.
We
God
enjoy
bless you.
the recording and Gigi's comment. I look forward for Gigi's comment. There is a lot of things that
I'm going to be very brief.
Good.
Yeah.
Whatever you like, whatever strikes your fancy.
Because otherwise I'm going to land up repeating, Ruth Wisse.
You put it there, and a lot of people, by the way, I always look at the recording, and there was a lot of viewers from last week. So,
amazing.
So when they see the video
Amazing.
from Xenia, they see also the comments of Gigi, and I look forward for both. I don't understand everything from the lecture.
Yeah,
I always
sums it up beautifully.
Look forward for Gigi's explanation.
And she points out some things that you may not have noticed, or maybe you did, but
you missed, exactly.
Yeah.
Last
Thank you, everybody.
Joined us very late,
Sandra.
and still she figured out the miss, and nobody could tell that Gigi didn't watch the whole thing. And we learned so much from the recording and from Gigi's comments after that. It's a beautiful. Thank you, Gigi.
Thank you.
All
Bye,
for
Gladys.
and next week continue